He made fun of an elderly man in first grade, but when he realized who it was, his confidence crumbled. It was the legendary actor Clint Eastwood. The boarding gate was bustling with the usual early morning commotion. Passengers prepared to embark on the Miami to New York flight, juggling coffee cups and carry-ons. They stood in neat rows, their faces reflecting a combination of fatigue and focus. In the first-class section, the ambiance felt both refined and restrained. One individual, however, drew attention. It wasn't merely his perfectly tailored charcoal suit or his polished leather shoes. It was the unmistakable air of superiority he exuded, silently demanding acknowledgement. In his late 30s, he appeared every bit the corporate Climbera man, accustomed to accolades and confident in his elite status. To him, this wasn't just travel. It was another stage to assert dominance, even among strangers. As he approached the gate, his leather briefcase swung rhythmically with his confident stride. A cursory glance at the other travelers revealed a trace of disdain behind his otherwise composed expression. Soon, he had settled comfortably into his first-class seat, idly scrolling through his tablet. It was then that he noticed the elderly man ambling down the aisle with nothing but a small duffel bag. The older gentleman's attire was modest, a beige windbreaker, a simple flannel shirt, and well-worn sneakers. His weathered face bore a tranquil demeanor, the kind born of years of experience and resilience, indifferent to trivial concerns. With little fuss, the man eased into his seat. He adjusted his jacket, stowed his bag beneath the seat, and gazed serenely out the window. To the businessman, however, he was an anomaly, a presence that didn't align with the first-class image. Casting a glance at the flight attendant assisting others, the younger man leaned slightly toward the elderly gentleman and remarked in a low, sarcastic tone, "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be." A few passengers nearby turned their heads, but the older man showed no reaction. He simply offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile before redirecting his gaze out the window. The businessman, irritated by the lack of response, tried again. "What's the special occasion? Did they start handing out free upgrades today?" His words carried a sharper edge this time. Yet the older man remained silent, fastening his seatbelt and keeping his focus on the tarmac. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any rebuttal could have. As the flight crew completed their pre-flight checks, the businessman leaned back, seemingly satisfied with his jabs. Yet as the plane taxied and prepared for takeoff, the older man's composed demeanor began to unsettle him. There was something disarming about such unshakable confidence, especially in a world obsessed with appearances. Unbeknownst to him, this flight would teach the businessman an unforgettable lesson. Part 2. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm, the soft chime of call buttons, the rustling of newspapers, and murmured conversations. However, the businessman, seated just a row away, found himself unable to let go of his earlier exchange. The older man's calmness, his refusal to engage, felt almost provocative. Crossing one leg over the other, the younger man leaned slightly into the aisle, casting a sidelong glance at the older gentleman, who continued to stare out the window. A sly grin spread across the businessman's face as he decided to probe further. "So, what brings someone like you to first class? Did you hit the jackpot or just come to relive the golden days of aviation?" His voice was loud enough for nearby passengers to overhear. A few exchanged uneasy glances, but no one intervened. The elderly man's reaction was measured. He turned slightly, locking eyes with the businessman for a brief moment. His gaze was steady, unperturbed, as though evaluating the younger man's motives. Without uttering a word, he returned his focus to the window. The lack of response only emboldened the businessman. Louder now, his voice tinged with mockery, he continued. "Not much of a talker, huh? I guess you'd rather reminisce about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones." Chuckling at his own quip, he seemed convinced he'd won this silent battle of wits. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm, the soft chime of call buttons, the rustling of newspapers, and murmured conversations. However, the businessman, seated just a row away, found himself unable to let go of his earlier exchange. The older man's calmness, his refusal to engage, felt almost provocative. Crossing one leg over the other, the younger man leaned slightly into the aisle, casting a sidelong glance at the older gentleman, who continued to stare out the window. A sly grin spread across the businessman's face as he decided to probe further. So what brings someone like you to first class? Did you hit the jackpot or just come to relive the golden days of aviation? His voice was loud enough for nearby passengers to overhear. A few exchanged uneasy glances, but no one intervened. The elderly man's reaction was measured. He turned slightly, locking eyes with the businessman for a brief moment. His gaze was steady, unperturbed, as though evaluating the younger man's motives. Without uttering a word, he returned his focus to the window. The lack of response only emboldened the businessman. Louder now, his voice tinged with mockery, he continued. Not much of a talker, huh? I guess you'd rather reminisce about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones. Chuckling at his own quip, he seemed convinced he'd won this silent battle of wits. Yet the older man's silence persisted. Folding his hands neatly, he adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a quiet gesture that conveyed dignity and restraint. Other passengers began to shift uncomfortably. A woman in her 50s cast a disapproving glance at the businessman. A young couple across the aisle whispered among themselves, their expressions mirroring the growing tension. Despite this, the businessman remained oblivious, leaning across the aisle to engage another passenger in a pressed suit. You know, he began, gesturing subtly toward the older man, some people just can't let go of the past. Always complaining about progress, as if nostalgia could make things better. No tech, no smartphone show did they even manage back then. The suited man offered an awkward chuckle, clearly disinterested in joining the conversation. Unfazed, the businessman continued until the flight attendant arrived with the beverage cart. Her professional demeanor seemed slightly strained as she stopped by the older man's row. Mr. Eastwood, she addressed him warmly, would you prefer coffee or tea? The businessman froze, the words striking him like a bolt of lightning. His tablet slipped from his hands as disbelief washed over him. Eastwood, Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor and filmmaker, renowned worldwide. The very man he had ridiculed was a Hollywood icon. Whispers spread like wildfire among the passengers. Is that really him? One woman murmured. It's Clint Eastwood, another exclaimed softly. The businessman's face turned pale as realization dawned. He had mocked not just any passenger, but a figure synonymous with resilience, wisdom, and strength. The weight of his mistake pressed heavily on him, leaving him speechless. Yet, his humiliation was far from over. The lesson unfolding before the entire cabin would be one he would never forget. The businessman sat frozen, the realization of his misjudgment hitting him like a tidal wave. Clint Eastwood. The name echoed in his thoughts, each syllable a reminder of his arrogance. He stole a glance at the older man, who now calmly sipped his coffee, seemingly unaffected by the whispers and glances spreading through the cabin. Passengers murmured softly, their curiosity piqued. That's Clint Eastwood, isn't it? A woman whispered to her husband. It has to be. Look at him, came the reply. The businessman's ears burned. Each whisper felt like a spotlight illuminating his earlier behavior. He wanted to disappear, to retract every word he'd said. His palms grew clammy as he struggled to compose himself. Finally, summoning his courage, he leaned forward slightly. Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood, he said, his voice low and hesitant. Eastwood turned slowly, his gaze steady and piercing. It wasn't a look of anger, but one of quiet authority, a presence that demanded respect without effort. Yes? Eastwood's reply was calm, his tone measured. The businessman fumbled for words. I didn't realize who you were. I am sorry for the way I spoke to you earlier. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. And if I wasn't who you think I am? He asked, his voice steady. Would that make how you treated me acceptable? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The businessman opened his mouth to respond but found no words. His face flushed as he realized the weight of Eastwood's point. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about respect. After a moment, he managed to whisper, No, it wouldn't. Eastwood nodded subtly, as though that was the answer he'd expected. Without further comment, he turned back to the window, leaving the businessman to grapple with the lesson he'd just received. The rest of the flight passed in reflective silence for the businessman. Eastwood's calm demeanor and poignant words replayed in his mind. He thought back to countless interactions where he had judged others by appearances, by their perceived status, or by what they could offer him. How many moments of genuine connection had he missed? As the plane began its descent, the businessman felt a mix of regret and newfound clarity. The words Eastwood had spoken weren't just a rebuke, they were an invitation to change. When the plane landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, Eastwood rose from his seat. The businessman watched as the older man retrieved his modest bag, slung it over his shoulder, and moved toward the aisle with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the flight. Before Eastwood exited, he paused briefly beside the businessman's seat. With a small, knowing smile, he said, "Take care of yourself," his tone carrying both warmth and finality. The businessman managed a nod, his throat too tight to speak. Those parting words lingered in his mind as he followed the flow of passengers out of the plane and into the bustling terminal. In the days that followed, the businessman found himself replaying the events of that flight. He began making conscious efforts to approach others with more humility and kindness. Small changes, a greeting to the janitor he'd previously ignored, a genuine thank you to the barista who prepared his coffee started to redefine his interactions. Months later, he found himself at another boarding gate. This time there was no tailored suit, no polished briefcase. He carried a simple backpack and wore a casual jacket. As he observed the people around him, he noticed a young family struggling with their luggage and restless children. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Need a hand?" he asked with a friendly smile. The parents looked at him gratefully as he helped them organize their belongings. As he settled into his seat, he thought of Eastwood's words. "Respect isn't about who the other person is, it's about who you are." That flight had been more than just a journey, it had been a turning point, a moment that reshaped his understanding of what it meant to truly respect others. And as the plane took off, the businessman gazed out the window, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He was still learning, still growing, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path.